Good morning and welcome from the Zappio Megaro in Athens. This is day 3 of the Delphi Economic Forum. And this is a panel on the international dimensions of the Greek Revolution of 1821. The role of the diaspora and the Philhellenes is our title, but we are going to widen our lens and try and look at the international dimensions in a much broader sense, because the Greek Revolution was indeed, in many ways, an international event. Before I frame our discussion with a couple of introductory comments, I do want to introduce our panel today. I'm here with 3 distinguished colleagues. On my left here in the Zappion Megaron is Yannis Kotsonis. Welcome, Yanni. Yanni is a professor of history and Russian and Slavic studies at New York University. He is the author of several important books on Russian history, and more recently has moved to look at the Greek Revolution and has published a Greek study on the role of empires and the Revolution of 1821. Joining us from the United Kingdom, 2 distinguished colleagues, Roderick Beaton, Emeritus Koraes Professor at King's College London, UK, and an author of several important books on Greek history and literature, a biography of Seferis, a book on the Philhellene Lord Byron, and more recently, his new book, Greece, a biography of a modern nation. Also joining us from the United Kingdom is Maurizio Isabella, reader in modern history at Queen Mary University in London. He studies the role of liberal revolutions in Southern Europe. He is co-editor with Constantina Zanu of Mediterranean Diasporas, Politics and Ideas in the Long 19th Century. Good morning to our colleagues in the United Kingdom. Apologies for the unfriendly hour. You should have seen the traffic in Athens. I'll just say that and leave it at that. Let me say just a few introductory comments before we open the floor to our discussion. As I said, the international dimensions of the Greek Revolution of 1821 are several. First of all, it's the era in which the revolution took place. Historians call this era the Age of Revolutions. Revolutions rather than uprisings. In other words, social movements that were aware of the potential to transform the status quo through their actions, as opposed to earlier uprisings. And of course, already the American and the Greek and the French revolutions had paved the way for the Greek Revolution. Another international aspect was the intellectual climate, the ideas of the Enlightenment that paved the way for liberalism and nationalism. Third, the diaspora. It's significant we are speaking here from the Zappion Megaron, which is one of the many buildings that the 19th century Greek diaspora contributed to Athens. In 1821, the diaspora initially abroad processed the ideas of the era and then many of them moved physically within Greece to take part in the revolution. Fourthly, the Hellenic Movement. Hellenic Movement both in Europe and the United States, which worked in those areas to raise funds and support the Greek Revolution, And of course, a number of Philhellenes moved to Greece as volunteers. The most emblematic figure of them all, of course, is Lord Byron. And finally, the great powers, the Austrian Empire, France, that was experiencing the Bourbon Restoration, Britain and Russia were to play an important role in 1821, underlining its international significance. What we will be doing is starting our conversation by considering, first of all, the legacy of those international factors. What do they mean today for us? And then we will roll back and look at those factors, examining their role in the Greek Revolution of 1821. Our purpose is to try and not only sketch out those factors, but maybe try and interpret them, even perhaps see which were the most important or not, although we might not necessarily agree. Before turning to Roderick Beaton, I have just one more comment of my own experiences. I've had a small experience studying Philhellenism in Philadelphia, and I did think I had found the answer to what was the most meaningful aspect of Philhellenism when I found a sermon by the Anglican Reverend Gregory Bedell in 1827, who invited the Americans in Philadelphia to support the Greeks. And someone directed me to that sermon, and I said, fine, this is the key. The sermon will answer the question, what was motivating the Philhellenes? And of course, when I read the sermon, the Reverend Gregory Bedell said, we've got to support the Greeks because they're fighting for liberty, because they're fellow Christians, and because they have suffered mightily in the hands of the Ottomans. Liberalism, religion, and humanitarian purposes. So I was back where I started. Maybe we will resolve that problem by the end of our panel. So may I turn to Roderick Beaton now and ask, Roderick, what do you think is the lasting international significance of 1821? Why are we here and discussing it now?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question, Alexander. And of course, it's a great pleasure to be, as it were, virtually at Delphi, which in fact is a Zapion in Athens. But good morning to everyone from the North Kent coast in the United Kingdom. The significance, from the point of view of the world Greeks in Greece and worldwide Hellenism, it's obviously the struggle for their own national independence, and that I think is what is commemorated and celebrated in Greece today. But what people around the world, whether they're Greek or not, I think don't realise is that actually the significance of the 1821 revolution is far greater even than that. Because effectively, it was the first of a series of changes that transformed the entire continent of Europe from the age of empires, of the 18th century, the early 19th century, into the age of self-determination of nation states that we live with today. So, I mean, I would argue, and I think this is why it is of central importance, not just for those of us who are Hellenists, but for all the international participation in this amazing Delphi economic forum that brings so many people together. It's something that in fact affects all of them. Because this was a vast geopolitical change. Before 1821, you've got a Europe of widespread, multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual, sometimes even multi-religion empires. And even, the outcome of the French Revolution, it turned into the Napoleonic conquest. Napoleon, in effect, tried to create a French empire on the same model. But the model that would actually be followed after 1815 and the defeat of Napoleon, it wasn't the one that the victorious powers tried to impose at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815 the so-called Concert of Europe, which was basically maintaining the status quo among those empires. And the first chink in that armor was the 1821 revolution, because that was the first revolution, a national liberal revolution in the old world of Europe, to be successful. Now, why it should be that that was successful is something we can discuss a little bit more. And I think my colleague Maurizio can shed a lot of light on the comparative dimensions, because the Greek Revolution wasn't the only one at that time. The Greeks succeeded in winning international recognition for a new nation state in Europe on the 3rd of February 1830. That was a year before Belgium. It was a generation before the Swiss Confederation of 1848. It was more than a generation before the famous national unifications of Italy and Germany that we usually think of as setting the seal on European national development in the 19th century. The Greeks were there first, and that process is still going on, not only in the European continent. I think Kosovo was the last new nation state to be recognized on that continent, but also actually around the world.
Let me pick up on the issue of the empires and their role that you mentioned, and ask Yannis Kotsonis. Going back to 1821, what was the role of the powers during the revolution and deciding its outcome? How significant? Which ones were the most significant?
Yeah. Well, thank you. You have to go even before 1821 to figure out what's changing around the time of the revolution and what makes the revolution possible. And the revolution takes place basically in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is a place of multi-confessionalism. Muslims are predominant in terms of political rights and power, right? Well, not rights, but privileges. Christians also have rights and protections afforded by the Sultan. It's not a happy place by any stretch, and this is the big problem of the Ottoman Empire. It's quite violent, it's quite unstable, there's a lot of arbitrariness and there's a lot of violence. I mean, the first way to solve a political problem in the Ottoman Empire was through violence and beheadings. And we have the catalog of all the people who are being persecuted, not for religious purposes so much, but because someone else wants their property. And the victims are not only Christians, but they're also Muslims, as much as they're Christians. And this was basically the status quo, and this was the nature of the Ottoman regime. And it changes when the French arrived on the Balkan coasts in 1797 and imported basically the French Revolution and the idea of a nation. They took over the Ionian Islands and then had an impact all across the Balkan Peninsula, followed then by the Russians, who also occupied the Ionian Islands, and they had an influence over on the mainland, and then finally by the British, who arrived and kept the Ionian Islands for themselves all the way to the 1860s. And so what each of them are doing is they're looking across at the Balkan Peninsula and looking at these populations, and they're assuming that the people that they're most interested in and the ones who they think would be most brotherly to themselves would be the Greeks, who they considered to be Christians, regardless of what language they spoke, and begin to deliver this message to the mainlanders that Greece is Christian and Greeks are Christian. And for the mainlanders, this was new. I mean, they knew they were Christians, but they were Christians among many other religions. It's the foreign powers that arrived, the empires arrived, and begin to tell them that they have certain privileges and also exclusive rights to this territory as the ones who have been there historically since ancient times, but more importantly because they're Christians. And this transforms the nature of Ottoman politics. So it's no longer just a struggle between one group of notables or peasants or merchants, Muslims and Christians together. It begins to become a struggle and transform into a struggle by 1821, which is going to be a struggle with a new binary, a new clear-cut binary, which is to say, on the one side are the Greeks, who are the same as the Christians, and on the other side are the Turks, who are actually not Turks. In most cases, they're usually Albanians, and they are the Muslims. And it creates this new binary and a new total nature of war, which hadn't existed before. There had been unrest, as you said yourself. There had been uprisings, there had been a small civil strife in different regions, but this becomes a total, all-consuming war in which only one of these populations will remain. So it's a demographic revolution. Now, the powers looking at the 1820s, at first looked askance at the Greek Revolution. They thought it was going to be like the Italian or Spanish revolutions that are going on at the same time. That these are going to be liberals, they're going to be revolutionaries, maybe even republicans, and they're horrified. I mean, the nature of Europe ever since 1815 had been to quash revolutions altogether, and they're in the process of quashing the Spanish revolutions, the Piedmontese Revolution, and the Neapolitan Revolution. And at first they treated the Greek Revolution the same way. They're hoping the Sultan would take care of it, we wouldn't have to worry about this. The Sultan doesn't. He creates instability in the region. So the powers finally, around 1826, and this is the role of Russia in particular, intervene and say, we're going to intervene in this conflict and give recognition of one sort or another to the Christians, and only the Christians, of that peninsula. And this begins a process which is joined then by Britain, and then finally by France, and these three powers decide that they're going to implement some sort of autonomy which is latched to the idea that demographically this has to be a homogeneous population in order to survive as a state. And the homogeneity will be the fact that all of them are Christian. So when the French forces then come in, with the Battle of Navarino, they defeat the Ottoman Egyptian fleet. Then the French forces come in to stabilize the region and to take out the combatants and send them so-called home. What they're actually doing is they're taking out all the Muslims and leaving behind only the Christians. And this becomes the nature of the Greek state. So it has elements of liberalism. This does survive. It's a little tortured in the beginning because the powers give Greece an absolutist monarch in the nature of the Bavarian Otto. But liberal movements do persist. But it's a liberalism mainly for the Christians. Right? And that's going to be the nature of the Greek state, which we're still grappling with.
Turning to you, Maurizio, the difference between the way the powers treated the Greek uprising to the others was, Yannis is telling us, because of the Christian binary, Christian against Muslim. What are your views on that, since you have also studied the other revolutions? No, we are not getting sound.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great, sorry about it. Yes. So, as Yannis said, the Greek Revolution takes place in the context of other simultaneous revolutionary events that unfold in Sicily, Naples, Spain, and Portugal, if we confine ourselves to Europe and we don't look at what is happening also simultaneously in Latin America and also in Asia, where there are many other revolutions. So, although in the context of Europe, the Greek event is unique because it's a revolt of a religious community against another one, the religious nature of liberalism that emerges in Greece is not unique. All the revolutions that take place in this period are equally religious events. Although Spain, Portugal, and Naples are religiously homogeneous societies, there's only a small minority of Orthodox in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, but there are no religious minorities in Spain and Portugal, unlike the Greek context. Nonetheless, the way in which freedom is conceived in all of these revolutions is religious. Liberty is a religious question. So what's happening in all of these religions is that the meaning of religion is rethought. Revolutions are not a push towards secularization. Revolutions are a moment in which the relationship between freedom and religion is rethought. The constitutions that are introduced in the 1820s, not only in Greece, but also in Spain, in Portugal, and Naples, all have a religiously defined notion of citizenship. You can be a citizen only if you are either Christian or Catholic, in the case of Naples, Sicily, Spain, and Portugal. And the idea of the nation that is supported in these revolutions is religiously homogeneous, because revolutionaries in Spain, Portugal, but also in Latin America believe that to have a religiously homogeneous society is an advantage to construct, to create a constitutional regime, because it prevents anarchy, prevents civil wars, it prevents social disintegration. So another crucial aspect of the Greek Revolution that is shared by other revolutionary movements around the world in this period is its millenarianism. As we know, there is a very strong millenarian dimension in the Greek Revolution that is rooted in the oracular tradition of the Orthodox religious culture that speaks about the beginning of a new era that will start with the emancipation of the Orthodox community, led by a savior that could be the Russian Empire. Now, these millenarian ideas of regeneration exist in other revolutionary contexts, are rooted in local millenarian traditions. You find one in Portugal, the idea that a great Christian emperor will come back again to rescue Portugal. The empire is applied to the idea that Portugal needs a constitution. But we find millenarian and revolutionary movements around the world in the 1820s. Think about the Wahhabi movement in the Arabian Peninsula. There is another threat to the stability of the Ottoman Empire, exactly in the same way as the Greek Revolution is one. And equally millenarian are the anti-colonial revolts that take place in Asia, for instance, in Java, where there is a huge anti-colonial rebellion against the Dutch Empire at the time that is profoundly millenarian in nature. I could also talk about the role of the clergy that is crucial in all of these religions, but maybe I should leave it there for the time being.
Thank you. It's an interesting challenge. We talk about the international dimensions of the Greek Revolution, and we're looking at the meaning that the powers attached to it. And whenever you look at international context from the particular view of the history of a nation, the challenge is how much international and how much whatever happens in that nation is specifically Greek, let's say. There's a international dimension, there's a specificity. Roderick, do we have a Christian Europe supporting Greece, or are there other dimensions to the way that the great powers, or maybe the Philhellenes, who we want to bring into the picture as well, regard Greece?
Well, I think it's very interesting the way this discussion has developed so far, because the Christian dimension has really come out very strongly. And obviously, it is an important dimension, and for most of the people who actually took up arms in Greece under the banner of liberty or death, it was very much the banner of Orthodox Christianity. So I don't dissent from any of that. But the other thing I would say is that every one of the other revolutions in Europe and further east we've been talking about during this period failed. And if the Greek Revolution had been only a matter of the Orthodox populace rising up against their Muslim masters and perhaps seeking support from Europe, I wonder if even that would have been enough to buck the trend and make the Greek Revolution the only one that succeeded. Because what I'd like to throw into the mix at this point is that the Greeks had another trump card, which was actually completely different from the religious one, though it kind of mapped seamlessly onto it. And this, I think, is one that puts the Greek Revolution more in line with the American Revolution and with the French Revolution, and particularly with the ideological underpinnings of the European Enlightenment. The trump card that the Greeks came up with was being able to say to the rest of Europe, and indeed to America, we are Hellenic. We are the descendants of what was in that time called the nation, that created the civilization to which all you Europeans and Americans owe your own civilization. And it worked. This was broadly an appeal to a secularist, movement developing from the European Enlightenment and seeking the very idea of liberty as an Enlightenment notion. It's not a religious notion at all. And it draws on the ancient democracies of the democracies of ancient Greece and on Republican Rome. And both the American and the abortive French revolutionary constitutions, these built very strongly on institutions and ideas and even nomenclature that went back to pre-Christian democratic Athens, Republican Rome. So Greece presented the opportunity to secularist Europeans and Americans who saw the origin of their own civilization in ancient Greece to try to vindicate that in the reality of what was happening on the ground, which I think there's more I'd like to say perhaps later if I get the chance about the Hellenes, who they were and why they became involved, but I think that's enough from me at this point. Thank you.
I'm reminded of Nicholas Biddle, one of the great Philhellenes in Philadelphia, who travels to Greece in 1806, studies the ancient monuments, goes back to the United States and becomes one of the main authors of the so-called Greek Revival architecture, and the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia has a facade which is eerily similar to the Parthenon's. Eerily, I say, for anyone visiting an American town and American cities where you can see very many architectural imitations of ancient Greece in the main government buildings. Yannis, ancient Greece, the trump card, as we know, Greece plays that trump card continuously for 200 years. Mm-hmm. Clearly it mattered initially when the revolution broke out. How far do you think it goes throughout the 1820s?
Well, so it's certainly there. I mean, there's no question about that. And again, when the Europeans arrived at the end of the 18th century, we're talking mainly about France, Russia, and Britain, are the ones that will matter most during the revolution. What they're looking for ancient monuments, ancient sites, and they spend a good part of their time trying to figure out what was this town in ancient times, because just about every town had a different name by then. You know, it could be Slavic, it could be Neo-Greek, it could be Turkish, Albanian. So they spend a good part of their time trying to remap the region to try to figure out where the ancient sites are. And they did look at the local population and said, yes, you are the descendants of the Greeks, but also they noticed that there's some differences. You know, that these people don't wear togas anymore. A lot of them can't read and write. They're not into philosophy the way they used to be, that there's been some changes in 2,000 years, understandably. So there's this ambiguity which continues today also. You know, think of the tourists who arrive here in Greece and they're looking for people in robes, you know, in sandals. In those days they arrived and they found people in kilts and in slippers, right? So there's going to be this tension there. You know, it is there, but they're going to deal with it in different ways, sometimes with outright contempt, right? Now, the classical tradition doesn't always mean that we're talking about the Enlightenment. So when Russian Philhellenes would look at Greece, they tend to capitalize not so much on the Athenian tradition, but on the Spartan tradition, meaning monarchy, militarization, conservative, slow, very careful in all their deliberations, but not democratic. So there is that Greek tradition as well. And also conservatives across Europe would also embrace that particular Spartan tradition rather than the Athenian tradition. That will continue all the way through modern Greek history. And if you're to look at, you know, moments of dictatorship, They're going to look very much at Leonidas, but not at Pericles, right? Pericles, after all, was a Democrat. What is a dictator supposed to do with Pericles, right? So there's that element. And let's remember when we're talking about Europe, Europe was not only the Enlightenment at that point. You know, after 1815, Europe was relatively speaking conservative in terms of the courts, the royal houses, the governments. It was quite conservative and quite retrenching. And so for them, when they're talking about Europe, they don't necessarily mean freedom, liberty, enlightenment. Some people do. And the revolutions that Maurizio is looking at are precisely about that, you know, about a certain liberty and embracing that European tradition. But the other European tradition, and the one that is going to be most significant in the course of the 20s, and with the creation of the modern Greek state, in the initial stages, is going to be much more religious, much more absolutist, much less room for liberalism and for democracy. These two forces, these two Europes, will be in tension with each other all the way through into the 21st century. Which Europe are we talking about, in other words? The Europe of Romanticism, where all of us have this ingrained identity, right? Or the Europe of the Enlightenment, which is that we are all shapeable. We can all change, we can all progress. These things continue to be in tension today.
Maurizio, a Greek specificity based on ancient Greece, a more moderated one, because Europe is not just one whole, but the Europeans look at the ancient Greeks differently?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. First of all, I'd like to, just for the sake of debate, to just comment on what Yannis and Roderick have just said. It seems to me that at some level, in their comments, they have assumed a binary or almost an incompatibility between Enlightenment and religion, and conservatism and Enlightenment. And also partly a difference between the Greek Revolution and the others. I'd like to suggest the opposite. First of all, because Enlightenment was also a religious movement, and there's nothing more religious than Orthodox Enlightenment. So we can see continuities between Enlightenment and liberalism also in their religious nature. Secondly, because Enlightenment is a very broad church and can be conservative as well as radical. And some Enlightenment figures faced with revolution rejected it. As Yannis said, that the Russians saw the Greek Revolution in a light that was different from some European radicals. So I think these varieties of political attitudes are present in each revolution, not just in the Greek one. In that sense, I think that the Greek Revolution is less peculiar and different from the others than maybe it's being suggested, but we can discuss it more. In terms of the way, in terms of going back to Philhellenism, I think that the great appeal of Philhellenism around the world is precisely due to the fact that it can, the Greek War of Liberation can be liked by everybody, from the conservatives, from Chateaubriand, to the very radical Republicans. So there's something to be picked out of the Greek Revolution for everybody, and that makes it very appealing. And so also the antiquity of Greece can be interpreted, as it's been suggested, in very many different ways. A peculiar way in which the antiquity of Greece is interpreted at the time is the one that is proposed by the Italian Philhellenes and the Italian volunteers who go to fight to Greece in the 1820s. And for them, what is appealing of the Greek Revolution is the historical bond that connects the Italian nation and the Greek nation throughout 2,000 years. And that's their own particular take on Philhellenism and particular take on the antiquity of the Greek nation that predates Ottoman captivity. So they write about, for instance, the fact that the Greeks brought liberty to Sicily with the colonies, and also that Venice rescued Hellenic culture after the conquest of Constantinople, when the exiled, the intellectuals came to Venice and brought with them their ancient manuscripts, and so on and so forth. So they speak about the continuous historical dialogue between these two nations to the extent that Italy and Greece are sister nations. So to conclude, what I want to suggest is that the Christianity of the Greek cause makes it appealing, and the European nature to a broad church of political positions, but there are also different types of Philhellenism. And I've just mentioned the Italian one as an example of two risorgimento, two national movements that are fighting together at the same time.
Thank you for raising the issue of binaries. I know all colleagues, historians, graduate students will be nodding their heads. We do not want to fall into the trap of analyzing with too much emphasis on binaries. This is a very interesting issue here. Do we have different types of Philhellenisms maybe in different parts of the world? Roderick, you've written a book on the most emblematic Philhellenes of all, Lord Byron. And I know Lord Byron had a huge impact in the United States, but maybe we have an English-speaking world Philhellenism and different Philhellenisms in other parts of the world?
Well, yes, and I mean, the first thing I would say is that the most famous Philhellene of them all, as it happens, the one that I've known most about, I suppose, Lord Byron, is completely untypical. So we really cannot generalise from Byron's distinctive contribution really to say much, I think, about Philhellenism in general. But if I just go back, particularly what Maurizio was saying, I mean, I couldn't agree more that Philhellenism, was so successful because it appealed to so many different instincts of so many different people. And what I would suggest again is, what makes it part of the trump card that worked for the Greeks. The other thing I would say, and to take issue to some extent with Maurizio, is rather wanting to emphasize, I think, how similar all these revolutions are. And I repeat, I think there's a question I asked earlier, and it's a question I don't know the answer to, and I would like to throw it into this discussion, and perhaps people listening would like to think about it as well. And it is this: because of what happened, we take it for granted that the Greek Revolution was going to succeed, because it did. But right throughout the 1820s, the odds, certainly in 1828, 1827, 1828, the odds are very much against that happening. And my question is, why did the Greek Revolution succeed when no other revolution at that time in Europe had done? It was the first. Now, let's go back to Philhellenism and Byron. As I said, Byron was very much a special case, and so much is woven into that iconic biography, and actually there's a whole industry of Byronists and admirers of the great man, trying to explain his involvement. The puzzle, the fascination about Byron's involvement is that actually we don't really know why Byron made the decision he did at all. One of the things that fascinates me about it is that the great Lord Byron, who made a name for himself writing inspiring verses about Greece and the Greek world, actually kept completely stunned for 2 whole years after the Greek Revolution had started. It took him until the spring of 1823 not only to decide to go to Greece and take part, but actually to make any private statement about the Greek Revolution at all. So, I think there's a question mark over Byron's Philhellenism. It came to him really quite late in life. And he also, very unusually for a Philhellene, before he committed to going to Missolonghi, where he sadly died shortly afterwards, he actually spent time in the British ruled Ionian Islands, learning what was going on in Greece. So that Byron was an incredibly fast learner. he imbibed an enormous amount of information about the very tangled politics of the Greek leadership at the time, and he made some very savvy points, which meant that Byron's actual contribution to the revolution was, was not the famous one of going into battle with the wearing his famous helmet, which he never did. It was actually to support what you might call the political wing of the revolution, and the wing which is most closely allied to the ideas of the Enlightenment and the American and French precedent, with the aim of creating an actual liberal state. So, I mean, in a few words, that is Byron's contribution, which has been overlaid by the fact that entirely fortuitously, he died of fever on the 19th of April, 1834, before he was able to put very much of his ideas into practice. But there's more to be said about other Hellenists and what motivated them, but I've said enough for now.
So let me get it right. We're about halfway through. You're inviting us to ask the big question. Why did the Greek Revolution succeed?
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Yanni, over to you.
No, I think that's a key question, and I'm glad Roderick brought it up. We're actually dealing with two questions here in this conversation. And one of them is, why did this revolution succeed, whereas the other ones patently failed? That's number one. And the second question is, what's the legacy of the Greek Revolution and the modern Greek state? So these are two separate things, and the answers are not identical. I mean, the short term versus the long term. As we know, the Spanish Revolution was put down by the French army at the very same time as the Greek Revolution was breaking out. The Austrian army is putting down the Italian revolutions, also at the very same time, or around the same time. And yet when it came to the Greek Revolution, they did not intervene to put down the revolution. And the short-term answer is, why did they not intervene? Is because they thought the Sultan would do it. They wouldn't have to worry about it. This is a matter for the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan couldn't, because he had problems of his own. I mean, he had a war with Persia. He had Ali Pasha to worry about. He had the problems of the Janissaries. 1826, in the middle of the Greek Revolution, there's a massacre taking place in Constantinople of the Janissaries, right? And that's supposed to have been traditionally the fighting force of the Ottoman Empire. So he's in no condition to put it down. So the powers intervene mainly to stabilize the Eastern Mediterranean. This is their primary goal, or this is the impetus. And they're going to do this, they claim, and this is in all of their documents, they say it everywhere. We're going to do this by homogenizing the population. For this state or this region, whatever it's going to be to succeed, it can only be Christian. So that's the short-term answer. Why does this revolution succeed? The revolution succeeds because the great powers intervene. That's it. When the great powers intervened, Egypt had occupied almost the entire revolutionary space, right? It was unlikely that the Greek revolutionaries were able to fight against the French-trained Egyptians, right? When the powers intervened in Navarino and then sent in the military expedition, they're the ones who secured a modern Greek state. So that's the short-term answer. Short-term answer is the great powers, and the short-term answer is also because this one was declaring itself to be a Christian revolution. All of the Greek diaspora, Kapodistrias, Koraes, all of these people are telling the Greek revolutionaries, do not identify yourself with the Italians. Do not identify yourself with the Spaniards. You're going to fail if you do that. Identify yourselves as Greek Christians. That's the only way you're going to succeed. And this is what they do in the end, with elements of liberalism at the same time. So that's the short-term answer. I mean, why does this revolution succeed? Now, that doesn't mean that therefore it was accidental, not at all. And I think what was created for all of its tensions was a modern Greek state, a modern Greek nation, which is to be admired in very significant ways. It has produced over the course of 200 years much greater integration. It's produced on the basis of a liberalism in tension with other things, but on the basis of a liberalism, citizenship for all of its population, means for the integration of newcomers as well, a higher standard of living, and a population which can demand rights. And this is one of the legacies of the Greek Revolution. So this, I think, is something to be admired for all the bloodshed.
Maurizio, we've complicated the question for you. Not only why did the Greek Revolution succeed, but short and long-term factors, or a short-term and a long-term answer maybe to that question.
Yes. Now, I couldn't agree more with what's just been said that basically it's true that the other simultaneous revolution failed and the Greek one succeeds, but what the shared feature is that their failure or success is decided abroad, is decided in Northern Europe. So it is decided in Paris, in St. Petersburg, in London, the destiny of these revolutions. And the reason why the Greek Revolution is supported ultimately also by military intervention is not only because it produces a Christian state, but also because it weakens the Ottoman Empire and it inaugurates the penetration by the European powers into the Ottoman world, undermining its sovereignty. So I'd like here to make a more general comment about the fact that when we think about the age of revolution as an age of transition from empires to nation states, we maybe, which is an accurate description of the events, we maybe miss something that is in the background, is that this is also an era of crisis of sovereignty and rethinking and recomposition of sovereignty, in which sovereignty, including the sovereignty of the new Greek state, is limited because the shared feature of the destiny of Greece, the Italian peninsula, and the Iberian peninsula is that these are weaker parts of the European continent whose sovereignty is limited. And this part of Europe and the Mediterranean in general is a very interesting space because it is a place where all types of interference from the Western powers is experimented in this period. Look at what happens after the Napoleonic period. Colonial rule is imposed in the Mediterranean. I mean, think about the Ionian Islands, Malta and Gibraltar. Intervention, the principle of intervention that Yannis has evoked. The French army invades Spain to put down the constitutional monarchy that had been declared in 1820. The Austrian army intervenes in 1821 to put down the constitutional regime that had been declared with the revolution 10 months before. But it's also a space where another typical example of intervention, interference in the sovereignty of others' polities is experimented. Gunboat diplomacy. We never think about it, but the Battle of Navarino is a classic example of gunboat diplomacy. The first example is 1816 in Algiers, 1827, the Battle of Navarino. You've got the ships that are there to put pressure on the Ottomans. The Ottomans do not comply with the armistice. There is a battle. 1830, Battle of Algiers, conquest of Algiers by the French. In early 1830s, Portugal. The British ships are outside the city of Lisbon to put support to the constitutional movement that is defeating the absolutists in the civil war. Now, this leads to my final point. This is an age of declarations of independence, and the Greece revolution introduces a declaration of independence, but it's also an era in which all of these revolutionary movements are aware of their weakness. They're aware that they cannot survive against the power of the northern European states. And therefore, in their view, declaring independence and asking for protectorates are not two incompatible things. The Greeks ask for a protection of Russia, France, and Britain, these empires, and they fail. So they are happy to combine declaring independence and protectorates. The Sicilians ask for the protectorate of the British Empire in 1820. The Genoese do the same. The Argentinians, who are rebelling against Spain in the same years, ask for a British protectorate, and they declare independence. So the nature of sovereignty as declared in when you say that your state is independent is ambiguous. It's not unlimited. It's compatible with the idea that, for instance, your state would be a tributary state to the Ottoman Empire. That's what Serbia becomes. That's a model available to the Greeks. If you look at what's happening outside the Mediterranean in the same period, and then I'll come to an end, For instance, in the Pacific Ocean, in the same period, New Zealand declares independence, Tonga declares independence, they write declaration of independence, but these documents are tools of the expansion of the British Empire hegemony in this era. So again, declarations of independence and imperial influence are not incompatible in the age of revolutions.
Oh, wow. So now we are actually stressing the international factors. In my mind, I thought we were going to see them as complementary, but what we may be saying here is there is a possibility that the international role in 1821 was so great that independence became, in a sense, it was a quasi-protectorate maybe, or at least it wasn't full sovereignty, or the role of the international factors, notwithstanding the advantages and the gains of the revolution, nonetheless, the international factor reserves a place, reserves the right to intervene and at least shape the events. And during Maurizio's analysis, I saw you nodding, Roderick. Not throughout completely, but I saw you were agreeing. Maybe that the great powers reserve a right to remain involved?
Well, yes, I was agreeing with a lot of that, and though again, my emphasis might be slightly different. What I'd like to pick up on what Maurizio was saying is that there's quite a serious trend among historians in the last couple of decades, really, in describing the independence of Greece as it developed from the 1830s right through the 19th century by the term crypto-colonial. And this is rather gaining ground, and it applies to other smaller states that followed later, that the nominal independence that was won by that and other revolutions was in fact a form of expansion by the European great powers. So thus far, I think I would go in step with what Maurizio was saying. I think it's also worth, and of course, in the case of Greece, as I think we all know around this table, as it were, for many Greeks throughout the decades and many of the 2 centuries since, the Greek Revolution was always unfinished business. The Greeks had never quite won the true total autonomy that they fought and their ancestors died for in the 1820s. So there is that sense of dissatisfaction with the outcome. But there's the other side of that coin that I'd like to emphasize is that the Protocol of London, that document I referred to, which is actually the first diplomatic document that recognizes Greek independence, 3rd of February 1830, it says in front that Greece will enjoy all the rights of sovereign independence. Now, there is precisely the rub, because we all know that Greece did not ever, at least not ever in the 19th century, enjoy those rights at all. And Maurizio is absolutely right. The British gunboats arrived off Koraes on no fewer than, I think, 3 occasions in the 19th century and at least one in the 20th. So there is a lack of fit between, de jure, by law, the independence that is nominal and the actual degree of self-determination that is possible for a small independent state. And again, I think it's worth remembering just how small and indeed how weak was the Greek state during much of the 19th century. We got a frontier drawn from south of Volos to the southern part of Epirus. It's less than half, about a third of mainland Greece as it is today, and only those islands, the Cyclades and the northern Sporades, and only those islands nearest to it. It's got the Ottoman Empire surrounding it on 3 sides, and the British protectorate in the Ionian Islands until 1864. The only way that such a state can make its way in the world is going to be through alliances working with greater powers. So, again, I come back to agreeing with Maurizio that independence in practice could not be incompatible with accepting a degree of dependency. And let's remember also that the Greek Revolution began exactly 200 years ago with famous appeals by its leaders to the governments of Europe. Ypsilantis, when he crossed the river Prut and raised the standard of revolt in Yash in Moldavia, the first thing he said was, the nations of Europe look on us with gratitude, and we return to them to ask for their support, because they didn't get. Petrobei Mavromichalis in Peloponnese, at the end of March 1821, addresses his famous manifesto to the people, the governments of Europe, asking for aid. So, the idea of accepting a degree of dependency is absolutely baked in to the struggle for independence. But I would argue they're not incompatible. And if you take, as Yannis was inviting us to do a moment ago, if you take the long view, yes, that sovereignty was frequently violated and was often the kind of masterful cryptic colonialism in the 19th century, into the 20th century, certainly until 1916. But from after the Second World War, where is it now? And I would agree absolutely with Yannis about the enormous advances that the Greek state has made, particularly in the last half century of its true century, towards developing inclusivity, democratic institutions, and international relations. Its reliance on a rule-based international order today, in the face of very serious challenges to that. And I would suggest also, just perhaps to bring the conversation more up to present day, that Greece's position within the European Union is significantly different from that crypto-colonial relationship with the European great powers at the time of the beginning of independence.
Yannis, I'm going to botch this metaphor, but is the glass half full and slowly filling, as it were? I'm sorry to be dumbing down your analysis, Roderick, but just for the sake of simplifying things, do we have in 1821 or the outcome of 1821, the short-term outcome that you spoke about, is partial independence, and the long-term consequence is foreign intervention, but gradually Greece, as Roderick suggested, coming out and away from that dependence and building it, the type of dependence that maybe was dreamt about in 1821.
Yeah. I'll go with the glass half full for sure, and I think things have gotten better. You never would have thought so in the 1820s, because demographically and economically it was a catastrophe. But that was a revolution and a war of independence, right? Now, in terms of this idea of foreign intervention, well, Greece establishes the model for tiny nation states, right? Tiny nation states. Remember how small it was back then. And it was joining the ranks of Latin American newly independent states in the sense that all of them depended on foreign sponsorship of some sort, or at least foreign support, but especially they depended on the foreign bond markets and on foreign loans. And this, of course, as we know, has not gone away. And Greece was born into debt. The debts that were arranged, which Roderick has written about, that involved Lord Byron, financed certain factions of the Greek Revolution, and then the loans that were given to the independent state in order to pay its bills and to pay for the Bavarian army and bureaucracy, which was the Greek government at the time. And this, of course, will never go away. Right? So Greece is going to be a tiny country in bond markets in which it is a tiny, tiny player. So there's always going to be intervention. It's not simply a matter of foreigners coming in and intervening in domestic politics. because there are parties in each of these countries who want to work with one or another foreign power. And so they solicit the intervention of those powers as well. So it's not simply colonialists coming in and dominating the country. There's an element of that, but it's also parties within within this country inviting the Russians, and then inviting the French, and then inviting the British, and then finally the Americans, in order to support their vision of what Greece should be like. So it's a part of Greek politics. To call it an intervention, yeah, it is. It is. But it's the reality of being a small country in huge international geopolitical games, and also in very, very large bond markets. Now, Greece is a small country, like many other small countries, has to maneuver somehow, and it's more or less done okay, with some serious problems along the way. But it's more or less done okay, measured as standard of living.
Let me take that small country term, and maybe here, Maurizio, there's an easier, or maybe a more a way in which one can see the similarities between Greece and Southern Europe, irrespective of the significance of religion and liberalism that we began talking about. Ultimately, there is an issue of these countries being small countries, gaining their independence or not gaining it immediately, but the small country factor being one that we should be using in our analysis. So when we talk about the international dimensions of the Greek Revolution of 1821, we would need an asterisk or an additional thing. By the way, this is a small country fighting for its independence. Therefore, short and long-term results have to be understood in terms of a small country within the context of a Europe with great powers and imperial countries, and see that almost like we are almost arriving at a north-south dialogue, a semi-periphery of Southern Europe, as the political economists used to call it a couple of decades ago.
Yes, I think, small country, but perhaps you think about Italy, when Italy becomes a nation state in 1860, it's geographically, in terms of territory, quite large. And Spain, I mean, was the head of a large empire, although it disintegrates, but it doesn't come to an end completely. And also Portugal is a smaller country with a large empire which partly disintegrates but do not disappear. So perhaps it's the geopolitical weakness that represents a shared feature of the destiny of these states from the 19th century, in the 19th century, not just the size, I would say. These are geopolitically weak, and the destiny of these countries is determined not in the capitals of these countries. This is, when we talk about this, I don't think we want to undermine the extraordinary achievement of the Greek Revolution. When I studied it, I'm full of admiration of how fast communities, for instance, embrace the notion of citizenship, coming out of a political context in which this concept did not exist. The way in which during the revolution there is, after all, a context of war and violence and death, there is this participate. Let's not forget, this is the first moment in which male universal suffrage is introduced in Greece, but also at the same time in Naples, in Sicily, in Spain, in Portugal. So all the population of Southern Europe vote for the first time in history, all at the same time. So this is happening in Greece, and there's a great desire. There are petitions when communities cannot vote because of the war, protesting that they want to vote properly. This is an incredible historical transformation, incredible achievement in itself to build new institutions out of nothing, right? So this is something that should be remembered as a great success. Certainly long-term legacies is the fact that Greece as a nation defines itself in religious terms, but again, this is not unique. Spain defines itself as a Catholic nation, and Italian nationalists do up to 1848. Then, because there is a problem with the papacy, things get more complicated. I agree with Yannis. The other long-term legacy of the Greek Revolution is the burden of the public debt as a tool of foreign interference into the running of the country that starts straight away from 1830 onwards. The treaty may guarantee, Treaty of London, the formal independence of the state of Greece, but the sovereignty is guaranteed by the foreign countries who tell Greece how they should pay back the debt incurred by borrowing money. And that is a long-term feature of the history of Greece.
Thank you. Roderick, we're in the final stretch. We've got about 9 minutes left. I won't talk about glasses half full and half empty and filling, but maybe as we wrap up, an overwhelming significance of the international factor, notwithstanding, of course, as Maurizio said, the huge achievement of the Greek revolutionaries.
Well, yes, I mean, I absolutely second that, and I mean, it starts very early, and it is. I mean, again, it's a half full, half empty kind of discussion, because at the time, a lot of Europeans said, "Well, these Greeks are backward. They're not really civilized. They don't become European very quickly." But actually, when you think of where they were coming from, they were, a neglected corner of a vast and rather ramshackle empire. It is extraordinary how quickly and how wholeheartedly the great majority of Greeks really bought into the national project and made it work, again, against the odds. And I think we kind of assumed that was going to happen because it did. But in the Europe of the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, before the battles of the early battles of the Risorgimento in Italy, it could well have been that this was just going to go nowhere. And it's down to those first generations of Greeks. Never mind the Bavarians who kind of bossed them around for a bit and denied a constitution for 10 years. But it was Greeks who made it work. And they had a bloodless revolution in 1843, and then they got their constitution, which was one of the most advanced in the world at the time. But I mean, the other thing I'd like to say before we finish is just to come back to what I call the trump card, which was playing the legacy of ancient Greeks. And I think in the 20s and 30s, it was a trump card. And one of the reasons that those great powers agreed and actually wanted to support the revolution at the end, somewhat reluctantly, was they could be persuaded that it was part of the whole restoration of post-Napoleonic Europe. If you believe that this is recreating ancient Greek civilization, you can't get more conservative than that. So the outcome of an actually progressive, liberal national revolution was dressed up as the restoration of an ancient civilization. So everybody, as Maurizio said earlier, you could buy into it. But long term, and here we are talking about the long term again, was that trump card became a millstone around the neck, did it not? Ever since, the modern Greeks have been completely unfairly and unreasonably compared to an artificial construct of a marvelous and superhuman ancient Greek civilization that no living human being could ever live up to. And I think one of the great sadnesses about modern Greece is that it hasn't kind of moved on from looking back to the ancient ancestors, as the Greek cliche has it today. Because these achievements we're talking about today, they're not achievements of the ancient Greeks, they're achievements of the modern Greeks. And I do just wish the modern Greeks could claim and receive more of the credit for that than they often get.
Yannis, wrapping up, international factor, is it something that is present and Greece, in a sense, is still living with it?
Which part exactly? I'm sorry.
The international factor, the dimension.
Well, of course, so again, there's a tension, right? It's not one-dimensional here. It's not even binary, as you like to say. It's a country which was brought into being thanks to the intervention of the empires. This is neither good nor bad. We're sort of, it's a fact. That's how Greece was born. So these powers would continue to be factors in Greek politics, domestic included, all the way to the present day. The powers might change, but we're basically talking about Europe and the United States. And Greece, as a tiny country, on a tiny peninsula, on the smallest continent, is going to have to somehow grapple with being a small player with very, very big other players. Sometimes it's going to work very poorly. It's going to work poorly, for example, with the fate of the debt in the course of the 19th century, which would be an occasion for constant intervention. I mean, literally, the gunboats arriving in Piraeus and Syros, right, to seize resources. Now, the debt itself was not that significant for those three powers, the ones who had guaranteed that debt. But it was a good tool for intervening in a strategically located country. So sometimes it works poorly. Another time it worked poorly was in the aftermath of the crisis of 2008, when unnecessary damage was inflicted on the population. It's still, to me, incomprehensible why they proceeded the way they proceeded. There would have been other ways to proceed. But other times it actually works quite well. So even at the moment today, you're going to see that Greece, for all of its debt, and for the fall in the per capita income, particularly for the lower groups, it's still a country which is enviable in most of the world. I mean, most countries of the world could only dream of such a standard of living in such a condition. It can use the foreign powers to play to its advantage. For example, currently, as is happening in Greece's relations with Turkey, when it has the support of a good part of the Western world. So even though it's small, it can play an outsized role and gain sympathy and active support. So you say, so how do you measure success in this case? Well, the one is the fact of independence which is achieved. And the other one, I think, is the important one, is the secular rise in the standard of living. Secular meaning, it may go up and down, but it's constantly going up. Right? And this is continuing even today. Even today. So generally speaking, independence, the nation state, it's worked pretty well for this country.
That sounds like a good note to wrap up this conversation. We started by talking about the international factors, ideas, Enlightenment, diaspora, Philhellenism, a number of things, but our conversation really focused on the broader picture of the international dimension seen through the eyes of the great powers and the international community. And our conversation was, as I said, very wide lens. And we saw and we examined the Greek Revolution in its international context. And that, I think, is a very important way that everyone should bear in mind when we look at the Greek Revolution. There is an important international dimension, complex. We may not agree on all its aspects and all its meanings, but it's there both in the short term and the long term. So thank you very much to Yannis Kotsonis, Maurizio, Isabella, and Roderick, Beaton. Maurizio and Roderick were joining us from the United Kingdom. And thank you, everyone, for your attention during our conversation on the international dimensions of the Greek Revolution of 1821. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander.